You want to know how it feels to watch incompetence parade around in a power suit? Let me tell you about my final hour at Meridian Biotech, where my career ended exactly the way it started, with someone confusing authority for intelligence. She lifted her latte cup, didn't even look up from her phone, and said, "Be useful and grab me another." Just like that. Casual as breathing. I smiled, slid a small black drive across her mahogany desk instead, and said, "This one's stronger." 10 minutes later, legal was screaming down the hallway like someone had lit the building on fire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what led to that moment, because it wasn't just about coffee or disrespect or even revenge. It was about 15 years of invisible work crumbling under the weight of one person's arrogance. My name doesn't matter anymore, they scrubbed it from most of the records anyway. What matters is what I built. For 15 years, I was the systems compliance lead at Meridian Biotech. Not the glamorous kind of job that gets you corner offices or company retreats in Cabo. I was the person who made sure every federal filing was pristine, every data encryption protocol was bulletproof, every regulatory framework was so tight it could survive a congressional hearing. I was the architect of their backbone, the guardian of their legitimacy. While everyone else played politics and chased quarterly numbers, I kept them from bleeding to death through paperwork cuts. Biotech isn't like other industries. One misplaced decimal in a FDA submission can shut you down for years. One missing signature on a compliance audit can trigger federal investigations that make root canals look like spa treatments. But here's the thing about being indispensable in the shadows: people forget you exist until the lights go out. And when Dr. Marcus Kendall, the founder who actually understood what I did, announced his retirement, I knew the lights were about to go very, very dark. Enter his daughter, Victoria Kendall Morrison. Fresh MBA from Wharton, 3 years of consulting experience at Daddy's Friends companies, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to face real consequences. She had buzzwords for breakfast and disruption for lunch. Everything was about modernizing workflows and streamlining legacy processes and pivoting toward agile compliance solutions. Translation: she wanted to delete 15 years of institutional knowledge because it looked messy in PowerPoint. Victoria, God, even her name felt like a slap, took one look at my department and decided it was bloated with outdated protocols. She actually said that. In a company meeting. About the systems that had kept them FDA compliant through 3 major regulatory overhauls and 2 congressional investigations. The first thing she did was announce a comprehensive review of all compliance procedures. Not to improve them. Not to understand them. To eliminate the ones that didn't align with modern efficiency standards. I sat in that conference room, watching her wave around a laser pointer at charts she clearly didn't understand, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "We're going to be asking some hard questions," she said, clicking to a slide titled Legacy Burden Analysis. Like, do we really need 17 different approval levels for a single data transfer? Do we really need backup documentation for backup documentation? Are we protecting the company, or are we protecting bureaucracy? I wanted to stand up and explain that those 17 approval levels existed because 3 years ago, a competitor tried to hack our clinical trial data, and those backup documentations were the only reason we didn't lose our license when a disgruntled intern tried to sell our research notes to a Chinese pharmaceutical company. But Victoria was already moving on to the next slide, already planning the demolition of systems she'd never bothered to learn. The erosion started immediately. Files that took months to organize properly were renamed overnight with Victoria's intuitive filing system. Encryption protocols that met federal standards were replaced with user-friendly alternatives that wouldn't have stopped a high school hacker. Authorization chains that protected millions of dollars in intellectual property were simplified into single-signature approvals. Every day, I watched another piece of our foundation crumble. Every day, I sent emails explaining why these changes were dangerous, offering to train the new staff, begging for just 10 minutes to explain why things worked the way they did. Every day, those emails disappeared into the void of Victoria's prioritized inbox management system. The breaking point came during what she called a legacy consultation session. Translation: she wanted me to explain my job so she could figure out how to eliminate it. Walk me through this compliance framework, she said, gesturing vaguely at my computer screen. But make it simple. I don't need the technical jargon. Simple. 15 years of regulatory architecture, and she wanted it simple. I tried. God help me, I actually tried. I explained how biotech companies need multiple layers of data protection because we handle everything from patient information to proprietary research. I walked her through the authorization hierarchies, the audit trails, the backup systems that had saved the company's license more times than I could count. She interrupted me every 30 seconds with questions like, but couldn't we just use cloud storage? And why don't we automate this with AI? And my personal favorite, isn't this just paranoia disguised as policy? Paranoia. She called 15 years of regulatory compliance paranoia. That's when I knew she wasn't just incompetent, she was dangerous. There's a difference between not understanding something and actively refusing to understand it. Victoria had crossed that line with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never faced consequences for being wrong. But the real insult came 3 weeks later, when she announced the modernization timeline. My department was being restructured, corporate speak for deleted. My protocols were being streamlined, corporate speak for ignored. My position was being evolved, corporate speak for eliminated. We're moving toward a more agile compliance model, she explained to the executive team, as if I wasn't sitting right there. Less bureaucracy, more efficiency. We're confident that our new automated systems will provide the same protection with half the overhead. Half the overhead. She was about to cut the company's regulatory protection in half and calling it progress. I raised my hand. Actually raised my hand, like I was back in grade school asking for permission to speak in my own meeting about my own department. Victoria, I said, keeping my voice level, automated systems are tools, not replacements for human oversight. The FDA requires specific documentation protocols that. That's exactly the kind of legacy thinking we're moving away from, she cut me off, smiling that patronizing smile that made my teeth ache. The FDA wants results, not paperwork. They want innovation, not bureaucracy. Results. Not paperwork. As if paperwork wasn't how you proved results to federal regulators. As if bureaucracy wasn't the immune system that kept companies from making mistakes that could kill people. I tried one more time. The authorization change you're eliminating aren't just corporate policy. They're legally mandated custody protocols. If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong, she said, with the certainty of someone who'd never been wrong about anything that mattered. We're implementing best-in-class solutions. Trust the process. Trust the process. She wanted me to trust the process while she dismantled the process that actually worked. That night, I sat in my car in the company parking garage for 2 hours, just staring at the concrete walls. 15 years. 15 years of building something that mattered, something that protected people, something that worked. And it was all going to disappear because someone with an MBA and daddy issues thought complexity was the same thing as confusion. I could have quit. Should have quit. Should have walked away with my dignity intact and let them learn the hard way why those legacy systems existed. But there was something else eating at me, something darker than professional frustration. They were treating me like I was disposable. Like 15 years of expertise was just dead weight they needed to shed. Like I was some relic from a less enlightened time, standing in the way of progress. The final 3 weeks were a masterclass in institutional gaslighting. Every day, Victoria would stop by my office with updates on the transition timeline. Every day, she'd ask for just a few more files to help the new team understand the essential functions. Every day, she'd reassure me that my institutional knowledge was being carefully preserved in their new systems. Lies. All of it. I watched them dump 15 years of carefully organized protocols into folders labeled things like old stuff and legacy docs. I watched new hires try to understand regulatory frameworks by skimming summary documents that missed every crucial detail. I watched Victoria nod approvingly as her team deleted backup files because they were taking up too much server space. But the worst part wasn't the incompetence. The worst part was the condescension. The way Victoria would pat my shoulder and say things like, "Don't worry, we've got this handled and change is hard, but it's necessary and I know this must be difficult for you." Difficult for me. As if my concern was emotional rather than professional. As if I was clinging to outdated systems out of nostalgia rather than trying to prevent a regulatory disaster. The breaking point came on my last day. My actual last day, when I was supposed to spend 8 hours transferring knowledge to Victoria's hand-picked replacement, a kid fresh out of college who thought compliance was about optimizing stakeholder engagement metrics. I'd spent the morning trying to explain why certain files couldn't be compressed, why certain authorizations couldn't be automated, why certain protocols existed for reasons that weren't immediately obvious. He nodded along, taking notes on an iPad, occasionally asking questions that proved he wasn't understanding anything I was telling him. "So basically," he said during our lunch break, "you've been doing things the old way because that's how they've always been done?" The old way. As if following federal regulations was a matter of tradition rather than law. "No," I said, feeling my patience finally start to crack. "I've been doing things the correct way because incorrect ways end careers and companies." He laughed. Actually laughed. "I think you might be overthinking this. Victoria says the new systems are going to be way more efficient." Overthinking. Efficiency. God, I was so tired of those words. That afternoon, Victoria called me into her office for what she called a transition wrap-up meeting. Translation: she wanted to make sure I wasn't going to cause problems after I left. Her office had been redecorated since she took over. Gone were her father's medical journals and regulatory awards, replaced with motivational posters about disruption and innovation. The whole room felt like a LinkedIn post come to life. "I wanted to thank you personally for all your hard work during this transition," she said, not looking up from her phone. "I know change can be challenging, but I think you'll be excited to see how much more efficient things become." Challenging. Efficient. She was using corporate therapy speak on me. "Victoria," I said, "I need you to understand something. The systems you're replacing aren't just policy recommendations. They're legal requirements. If something goes wrong..." "Nothing's going to go wrong," she interrupted, finally looking up from her phone. "We've done our homework. We've consulted with experts. We're confident in our new approach." Experts. I'd been there for 15 years, and she'd consulted with experts. "What experts?" I asked. "Our implementation consultants. They specialize in regulatory modernization." Implementation consultants. People who knew how to install software but had never sat through a FDA audit. I tried once more. "The authorization protocols you're eliminating aren't just bureaucracy. They're custody chains. Legal custody chains. If you sign documents you're not authorized to sign." "I'm authorized to sign whatever needs signing," she said, with that smile that made my stomach turn. "I'm the VP of Operations." That's when I realized she didn't just misunderstand the systems, she fundamentally misunderstood her own authority. She thought being VP meant she could authorize anything, sign anything, approve anything. She had no idea that regulatory authority was specific, limited, and legally defined. She had no idea that I was still, technically, the primary custodian of record for all compliance documentation. That my signature was the only one that mattered for federal filings. That her fancy title meant nothing to the FDA if she couldn't prove chain of custody. "You're still on payroll for another hour," she said, glancing at her watch. "Why don't you make yourself useful and grab me an iced mocha? There's a good coffee place in the lobby." Make myself useful. Get coffee. 1 hour left on 15 years of service, and she wanted me to fetch beverages. That's when I felt it, not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something more precise. The emotional equivalent of a scalpel finding exactly the right place to cut. I looked at her sitting there in her ergonomic chair, surrounded by motivational posters, completely confident in her own competence. I looked at the mess she'd made of 15 years of careful work. I looked at the disaster she was about to unleash on a company that employed 300 people. And then I looked at the small black drive sitting in my desk drawer. The compliance encryption key. The master authorization for all federal documentation. The key that proved legal custody and authorization for every single regulatory filing the company would ever make. She thought she had authority because she had a title. But authority isn't about titles. Authority is about documentation. And all the documentation still pointed to me. I pulled the drive from my drawer and walked over to her desk. She was already back to scrolling through her phone, probably planning her next efficiency improvement. Here, I said, sliding the drive across her mahogany desk. You'll need this for all your new ideas. She looked at it, confused but dismissive. Just a small black device, nothing impressive. No labels, no obvious significance. What is it? She asked, not really caring about the answer. Authorization key, I said. For compliance documentation. Chain of custody transfer. She shrugged and dropped it into her desk drawer, already losing interest. Great. Thanks. Chain of custody, broken. Authorization transfer, documented. Legal responsibility, officially transferred to someone who had no idea what she'd just accepted. The system would flag it automatically within hours. The moment she tried to sign anything, file anything, authorize anything, the automated compliance checks would start screaming. And every regulator in the federal system would want to know how someone without proper authorization had been signing documents for weeks. I didn't slam the door on my way out. Didn't make a scene. Didn't even say goodbye. I just walked to my car, drove home, and made a cup of tea. The first call came 3 hours later. Victoria's panicked voice on my voicemail, demanding I explain some kind of system error that was blocking all their filings. The second call came from legal, slightly more professional but equally desperate. The third call came from the FDA, and that one I definitely wasn't going to return. I sat in my kitchen, tea growing cold in my hands, watching my phone light up with increasingly frantic messages. The automated compliance system was doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting the company from unauthorized actions. The only problem was that Victoria had never bothered to get properly authorized. Every document she'd signed over the past month was now flagged as potentially fraudulent. Every regulatory filing was on hold pending authorization review. Every federal interaction was suspended until the custody chain could be verified. The news broke 2 days later. Meridian Biotech faces federal investigation over compliance failures. The article was brutal but accurate. Unauthorized signatures on federal documents. Broken custody chains on regulated data. Security protocols that wouldn't have stopped a determined middle schooler. The biotech industry is small, and news travels fast. Within a week, Meridian was a cautionary tale at every regulatory conference. Within a month, their federal licenses were suspended pending a full investigation. Within 3 months, the company that had survived 15 years of flawless compliance was hemorrhaging money and talent. Victoria lasted 2 weeks after the story broke. Her replacement lasted 6 months before admitting they couldn't fix what she'd broken. The company finally hired back some of their legacy staff, the people who actually understood how biotech compliance worked, but by then it was too late. Too much damage, too many bridges burned, too many regulators asking too many questions. I never went back. Didn't need to. My LinkedIn was flooded with job offers from companies who suddenly remembered that regulatory compliance wasn't just bureaucracy, it was the foundation that kept everything else from collapsing. But here's the thing that keeps me awake sometimes, the thing that makes this story more complicated than simple revenge. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't hack their systems or delete their files or plant evidence. I didn't even lie or manipulate or scheme. I just stopped protecting them from themselves. For 15 years, I'd been the immune system that kept their institutional body from rejecting itself. I'd caught their mistakes before they became disasters. I'd built systems robust enough to survive their incompetence. I'd been the quiet guardian who made sure their arrogance never quite reached the level of self-destruction. And when they decided they didn't need that protection anymore, I simply agreed. The drive wasn't a weapon. It was documentation. Legal, proper, completely legitimate documentation of a custody transfer that Victoria had legally requested by taking operational authority. The system flagged her actions not because I programmed it to, but because I'd spent 15 years programming it to catch exactly that kind of unauthorized behavior. She destroyed herself with the same competence she'd used to destroy my department. The same casual dismissal of expertise that had made her ignore my warnings also made her accept responsibility for systems she didn't understand. The same arrogance that convinced her she didn't need oversight also convinced her she could handle authority she'd never properly acquired. It wasn't sabotage. It was paperwork finally doing its job. The irony is perfect, in a way that makes my chest tight with something between satisfaction and sorrow. Victoria spent months talking about efficiency, about cutting bureaucracy, about moving past legacy thinking. And in the end, it was bureaucracy that brought her down. It was legacy systems, working exactly as designed, that protected the institution from her efforts to modernize it. The regulatory framework I'd built didn't just enforce compliance, it enforced competence. It made sure that only people who understood the rules could break them safely. And when someone tried to operate outside their expertise, outside their authority, outside their understanding, the system simply stopped them. Sometimes I wonder if I could have handled it differently. If I could have found a way to make her understand, to bridge the gap between her ambition and my expertise. If I could have saved the company without destroying her career. But then I remember that condescending smile, the casual dismissal of 15 years of work, the way she treated institutional knowledge like personal opinion. I remember her calling regulatory compliance paranoia disguised as policy. I remember her telling me to get coffee while she dismantled everything I'd built. And I remember that some people can't be saved from themselves. Some disasters are so eager to happen that all you can do is step out of the way and let physics take its course. Victoria taught me something important in those final weeks. Competence without authority is invisible, but authority without competence is radioactive. It doesn't just fail, it contaminates everything around it. The company survived, eventually. Under new leadership, with new respect for the systems they'd almost destroyed. They reached out to me twice, offering consulting contracts to help rebuild what Victoria had torn down. I declined both times. Some lessons need to be learned the hard way, and some expertise can't be rebuilt, it has to be earned. I found new work easily enough. The biotech industry has a long memory for competence and an even longer memory for compliance failures. Companies that had never heard of me before suddenly wanted to know about my robust regulatory frameworks and proactive compliance strategies. Funny how preventing disasters makes you popular after someone else creates one. But the real victory wasn't professional. It was personal. For months, I'd felt invisible, discarded, irrelevant. Victoria had made me feel like my expertise was worthless, my experience obsolete, my concerns ignorable. She was wrong. Catastrophically, federally, career-endingly wrong. The systems I built didn't just survive her attempts to modernize them, they protected themselves. The expertise she dismissed as legacy thinking turned out to be the only thing standing between the company and regulatory annihilation. The bureaucracy she mocked as paranoid proved to be the foundation that everything else depended on. In the end, Victoria got exactly what she wanted: efficiency. The swift, elegant efficiency of natural consequences. The streamlined simplicity of cause and effect. The modern, agile process of watching incompetence devour itself. Now I work for a company that understands the difference between innovation and destruction, between modernization and demolition. My new CEO has an engineering background and a healthy respect for systems she doesn't personally understand. When she wants to change protocols, she asks questions. When I explain why things work the way they do, she listens. It's a radical concept, treating expertise as valuable rather than inconvenient. But late at night, when I'm reviewing compliance reports or updating authorization protocols, I sometimes think about Victoria. I wonder if she learned anything from the experience, if she ever figured out the difference between authority and understanding. I wonder if she ever realized that the systems she destroyed weren't obstacles to progress, they were the foundation that made progress possible. Probably not. People like Victoria rarely learn from failure because they rarely accept responsibility for it. She probably blames the outdated systems or the change-resistant culture or the bureaucratic mindset that sabotaged her vision. She probably never realized that the person fetching her coffee was the only thing standing between her and professional annihilation. The truth is, I didn't win because I was smarter or more ruthless or better at office politics. I won because I was right. I won because 15 years of expertise turned out to be more valuable than 3 months of competence. I won because competence, given enough time and rope, always hangs in competence. But the deepest satisfaction isn't that Victoria failed, it's that the systems worked. The regulatory framework I spent 15 years building did exactly what it was designed to do: protect the institution from threats, internal and external. When someone tried to operate beyond their competence, beyond their authority, beyond their understanding, the system recognized the threat and neutralized it. Not through malice. Not through sabotage. Through simple, elegant, bureaucratic precision. Victoria wanted to move fast and break things. The compliance framework I built made sure that when things broke, they broke safely. When she broke the authorization chain, the system caught it. When she exceeded her regulatory authority, the system flagged it. When she signed documents she wasn't qualified to sign, the system stopped her. The system I built saved the company from the leader who was trying to save it from me. That's the thing about institutional knowledge, about regulatory expertise, about the kind of work that happens in the shadows. It's not glamorous until it's gone. Nobody appreciates the immune system until it fails. Nobody values the foundation until the building starts to collapse. I spent 15 years being invisible, being taken for granted, being treated like overhead rather than infrastructure. And then, for one perfect moment, my value became undeniable. Not because I fought for recognition, but because Victoria created a situation where competence was the only thing that mattered. She gave me the greatest gift possible, the chance to be right in a way that couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or explained away. The coffee request was just the trigger. The real weapon was 15 years of expertise that she'd never bothered to understand. The real trap was her own confidence in systems she'd never learned to respect. I didn't destroy Victoria's career. I just stopped protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. I stopped being the buffer between her ambition and reality. I stopped cleaning up the messes she didn't even know she was making. And reality, it turns out, has sharp teeth. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened. If I think I went too far, if I could have handled it differently, if I should have tried harder to make her understand. The answer is simple: I tried for months to make her understand. I sent emails, requested meetings, offered training, explained consequences. I did everything short of skywriting to communicate why her changes were dangerous. She chose not to listen. She chose to treat expertise as opinion, caution as cowardice, experience as obsolescence. She chose to believe that competence could substitute for competence. I didn't make those choices for her. I just stopped compensating for them. The real tragedy isn't that Victoria failed, it's that she had to fail. There was no way to save someone so committed to her own brilliance, so convinced of her own rightness, so dismissive of anyone who might know better. Some fires start themselves. All you have to do is stop trying to put them out. The saddest part is that Victoria could have been great. She had energy, ambition, genuine desire to improve things. But she confused having ideas with having understanding, and that confusion turned every strength into a weakness. Her confidence became arrogance. Her ambition became recklessness. Her desire for efficiency became willful blindness to necessary complexity. She wanted to be a revolutionary leader, but she ended up being a cautionary tale. And me? I wanted to be helpful, valuable, respected for my expertise. I ended up being all of those things, but only after I stopped trying to earn them and started simply demonstrating them. The lesson isn't about revenge or justice or cosmic balance. The lesson is about the difference between earning authority and assuming it, between understanding systems and controlling them, between making things better and making them different. Victoria never learned that difference. But the regulatory framework I built never forgot it. In the end, that's what saved the company and doomed her career, the persistent, patient, unglamorous insistence that competence matters more than confidence, that understanding matters more than authority, that some things can't be improved until they're first respected. You don't need revenge when you have receipts. Some fires start themselves, all you have to do is stop cleaning the ashes. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very patient, you get to watch incompetence burn itself down with the same matches it used to light its own success. That's not cruelty. That's just paperwork, finally doing its job.